Welcome to Writing and Influence, the podcast where words meet impact. I'm your host, Elaine Acker, and I believe that publishing, whether it's a book, a blog, or even a simple social post, has the power to amplify your influence and change lives. Your words have power. Let's start writing with purpose. Today, I am excited to welcome best-selling author Susan Wiggs to the show. Now, Susan is the author of more than 50 novels, including some of my favorite titles like The Apple Orchard, Family Tree, and The Lost and Found Bookshop, which I am rereading right now because I love it so much. Her books have touched millions of readers, and they regularly land on the New York Times bestseller list. She's writing stories from the heart that I think give us an extraordinary sense of human connection at a time when I think we need that more than ever. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about the writer's journey and the power of storytelling and what it takes to build a creative life that will last. So, Susan, thanks for coming on with me today.
Elaine, this is such a pleasure. We've known each other for a long time, but we haven't seen each other in forever. So
Years.
great to be with you.
Thank you so much. You know, as a publisher, we were just talking about, the nonfiction side of things. You work on fiction, a highly popular commercial fiction, but I'm just going to dive in and say, what are the elements of fiction that you think nonfiction writers could really use to make their work more powerful?
That's actually something that I embarked on back when I was in graduate school. I was working on graduate level papers and reports and things like that. And the graduate students in my study group were such poor writers because they were so didactic, they were dry and everything. And so we actually formed a group to make ourselves better storytellers. And so what we did was we tried to figure out the elements to apply to our nonfiction work that would make it more readable, more accessible. And indeed, that was the kernel of my fiction writing career. I didn't make stuff up to put in my graduate papers, but I used those techniques, make it a page turner, leave the reader wondering about something. And also, probably the number one key is be a storyteller who elicits emotion, whether it's a report on some dry topic, I don't know, aluminum extrusions or sales report. I don't know. And it's possible to do. And so I read a lot of narrative nonfiction for my work because I read things. And the ones that really hold my attention and stick with me are the ones where the writer didn't just report something to me, but instead they involved me on more than one level, not just my intellectual level, but my emotional level or my social level or something like that. And so I think see yourself as a storyteller because everyone's a storyteller. And so take your nonfiction and make sure that it's relevant on more than one level, not just the factual level. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And I'll tell you another thing that I see a lot in your work, and I was going to touch on that later, but maybe we'll just touch on it now. When I think about your work, I see description and your settings that come through and this sense of place. And I think description may be another place where some nonfiction writers could really have more of a literary nonfiction feel by adding in more distinct description. Do you agree with that?
I do. You want to bring this scene to life, whether you're, in an office complex or, I read a lot of history for some of my books for the backstory. You kind of want to bring the setting to life, and description is one way to do that. And something that I learned from one of my favorite, I guess now retired, many years retired romance writers. Her name was Laverle Spencer. And she was very, very popular in the 80s. And I remember I went to a workshop and she said that one of her favorite senses to access was called synesthesia. And it was when you activate more than one of the five senses at once, like, I don't know, a green wind when, you're standing in a field of cut grass or something like that, and you feel the wind and you smell the grass, something like that.
Uh,
So the more you can give the reader that sensory involvement, the more you're going to draw him or her into your story.
awesome. And this next question is a little more tactical, but I find myself having a conversation over and over, especially with first time writers, and they can be brilliant people, CEOs who are working on their first book because they're trying to capture this knowledge and expertise they've accumulated over the years and put this into a book. And so it's all in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get hung up not so much even on getting their knowledge out, but on how to organize their day. And it's really a funny thing that trips them up. So for you, what does your writing process look like? Tell me a little bit more about what it looks like, what times of
Well,
day. I mean, is there anything
Well,
predictable there?
I think that we all talk about this endlessly because every writer is convinced that everybody else has the answer, and we've just been wrong
Yes.
all along. And I'm not a good person to ask because it's funny, I'm sort of arbitrary in the way I go at things. And it's weird because I shouldn't be. In my former life, I think back when we first met, I was a teacher. And teachers are very much on a schedule. The school bell
Yeah.
rings and you follow a schedule. And in fact, when I was a new writer and I was doing both, I was teaching, writing, and mothering. It was kind of a juggling time in my life, but I was just I had the discipline imposed on me. I could write during my lunch
Mhm.
hour if I didn't have lunch duty, and I could write on the weekends and in the summers. And that was kind of how I organized my writing projects. When I became a full-time writer, the challenge was to impose that on myself. And for me, it's a huge challenge. I do know writers who stick to a strict schedule. And so I think now I feel like I'm lucky if I can put words down on the page every day. And I say every day, I mean 5 days a week, even better if I can do 7 days a week. I definitely it's a 40-hour work week for me, but it's not like 40 contiguous hours like a work day that I
Yeah.
go to and from. And being a woman with first a kid and now grandkids, husband, elderly parents, I've had the whole journey that we all have. And for me, I've had to make writing sometimes during my life, I've had to make writing fit my life rather than my life fit writing. And I remember
Mm,
reading, I think it was an
good.
article or an excerpt by John Irving, the author. And he said, well, get your wife to do this for you so that you can write and get a job like a rural mail carrier where nobody interrupts you and you can just, you can write. And I thought, that's not the real world of a typical writer, is it? To kind of navigate. And sometimes it's a wavy road. However, as anybody who's tried to write knows, there's no shortcut. You've got to get the words on the page. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, a lot of times it involves me just kind of blocking everything else out. And I am that writer who writes everything out in longhand. And
Oh, do you?
I started that way when I was a kid, and I never quite outgrew it. And there were times when I tried to discipline myself to compose right on the computer because
Yeah.
I thought, well, I'll skip that step of having to transcribe. But now with all of the distractions that the computer offers, it's
Mm.
actually I'm actually more efficient when it's only me and my notebook. And here's one that I can show you. It's kind of a mess, but it works for me. But that's kind of what my
That is
I know.
so interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and it used to be more awful than it is now because I used to hate to transcribe because I don't love to type. But now
Yeah.
you just read it. You just read it into your phone, email it to yourself, and there are your words on the page. I mean, you got to read over it and make sure that there's not
Yeah.
recognition errors. But I think you there's no shortcut and there's no way to completely eliminate distractions, but I think you eliminate as many as you can, block out some hours. When I did have some really tight deadlines, I did make a calendar for myself. And I
Mm.
X'd out every day where there was an appointment or some other competing thing that I had to do or I had to be away. But any blank day, I would, kind of highlight and make sure that I spent my time writing that day.
Awesome. Well, and I love that you said, the point is you have to get words on the page
Mm.
consistently to get to the end of the story.
Mhm.
And that's just one of the things I've tried to convey too is even if you only did 500 words a day, which is not much. I mean, people are writing social media posts longer than this, right? So if you just did 500 words a day in 6 or 8 months, you'd have a book
Mhm.
draft that you could then start revising and editing and doing something with.
Mhm.
So it's not out of reach, however that happens for you. So that's awesome. Now, we've referred to knowing each other a little bit, and you and I, oh, so many moons ago, were both part of that, you know, what was it? Society of Children. It was such a long acronym.
Yeah, well.
Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators.
Mhm.
And so that's where we went. We've both gone wildly different directions since then. Tell me a little bit about, what were you imagining as your path back then and how did that kind of evolve? And tell me about that.
Yeah, I was one of those writers almost literally out of the womb. I mean, my mother, I don't know why she saved these, but no, I do know why she saved these. She saved these little drawings and stories that I made starting at age 2. And I know why she did it because I'm the middle of 3 little kids, and so she was, like, surrounded and drowning in little kids, and so when she would write to her parents, because this was back in the '60s, when she would write to her parents
Yeah.
who lived in Florida, she would just tuck our little stories or whatever scribbles into and my grandmother saved them, and so I have these little
Yeah.
stories where
Ah,
I used to make the stick figures and the scribbles, and I would tell my mom the stories, and she would write them down. And so I actually have some of, my very like earliest things. And so I'm one of those writers that just thought the whole world was a story. And I always thought that way. And the reason I can't remember why we were both members of that. I think that any writers group, whether it's a genre or anything like that, I think it's a way for writers to get together. And that's really key for a lot of writers because it's such an isolating kind of pursuit. You
it
have to be
is.
alone in a room, but it feels really validating and supportive to reach out and be with other people who kind of are on that same path. And so I didn't really ever think I would be a children's book author, but I guess because of my connection to children through teaching and because probably the main reason was it was like right in my neighborhood where we used to meet.
Uh,
It was just a way to connect with other writers. And there's so much, as you mentioned earlier, Elaine, there's so much in common. The process doesn't look that different, whether you're writing a children's book or a nonfiction book or a novel or a poem, even. It doesn't look that different for any writer. And so for me, I always pictured myself writing the kind of books that I love to read because,
mm,
like every writer that I know, I'm just a passionate reader. In the '80s, when I really got serious about I want to write novels. I want to publish fiction. I paid very close attention to the kind of books that I was reading. And I was reading a lot of super, super commercial best-selling fiction, romance fiction, family sagas, the big, juicy, emotional big reads that, the Thornbirds and Danielle
yeah.
Steele and all the big bestsellers, Kathleen Woodiwiss. I was reading all those, and so I always saw myself as somebody working on those, and indeed, those are the sort of books that I found myself publishing.
Yeah. Are you part of a writers group now?
Not an organized one. This one is just like our homegrown. We call it a critique group because we read each other. There's only 5 of us. We read each other's work. We're very diverse. We've got somebody who writes children and adults. We've got a literary fiction author and a magical realism author. And we've got me, and I'm like hyper realistic, only with better endings, right? I have a book that's coming out on July 15th. I hesitate to say it's historical, but it starts in 1968. It's based on a true story of a horrible Magdalene Laundry. Do you know what those are? Or the
I
mother
don't.
homes where they used to hide, wayward girls away. It's called Wayward Girls.
Oh, I do know what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
well, it turns
Yeah,
one of the worst ones. Most people are familiar with them in Ireland. That small things like these, and there was a book called or a movie called Philomena about this situation in Ireland. But what I discovered was that they were very pervasive in the U.S. And the worst one was in Buffalo, New York. The actual building is still there. So if people go to my Instagram, for example, you can see a little video of the actual place where all of this
wow.
drama took place. So Wayward Girls starts there, but it kind of follows these women through their lives to present day. And it's super dramatic, and it will make my readers happy and maybe surprise them as well. It surprised me when I was writing it.
Well, how did you find out about that story?
That's actually a good story, because I often don't remember how I came up with my ideas. People always,
Yeah.
where do you get your ideas? I don't know. But this one was very specific because it was my big brother, John, and I, we lived near Buffalo when we were kids. And then we moved away and never came back until we were adults. And so in 2021, we went on like this nostalgia tour, with his wife
Yeah.
and husband. The four of us went on a nostalgia tour to go look at this little bitty small town outside Buffalo, New York. And we went to our church, our Catholic church, where we both went. And I don't know if you would call it a recovered memory, but it's something that I forgot, and then it was triggered. We were standing in front of this church, and I think there's actually a picture of that on my Instagram too. And John and I were standing in front of this church, and I had, for some reason, and then we went inside, and there was a smell. I mentioned synesthesia earlier. Smells can
Mhm.
trigger memory, things like that. And it must have been the incense, or something like that. And I remembered right before we moved away to Europe, but right before we moved away, he got to be an altar boy for like 5 minutes, and and he was the thurifer. There's a word for you, thurifer. He's the one who carries the thurible. And the thurible is that it's usually a brazier, like a brass vessel on a chain, and it's got the incense and the
Oh,
coal
the
in it.
swings?
Yeah, yeah, they
Yeah.
swing it
Okay.
way up the aisle during high mass. And so that was like his job. And he was probably small for his age or something. And he was wearing the red cassock and the robes and all that and dragging. And I remember he had like his Converse tennis shoes underneath his altar boy. And as he was going up the aisle, hit him and his sleeve caught on fire.
Oh,
And,
no.
and I never thought of that again. And I asked,
Yeah.
I remember, I was like, did that happen? And he said, yeah, I remember that, and he slapped it out. It was not that big a deal, but I remember.
Yeah.
I started thinking about the Catholic Church in the 60s and the influence that it had on kids and families and everything. I just went down a rabbit hole of research, and I discovered this incredibly harsh, abusive system against girls who didn't have just unplanned pregnancies, but girls who had been failed by the foster care system, who were deemed inappropriate in some way by their own families. And they
Yeah.
were just kind of parked in these institutions. And there were about 38 of them at least, and across the US. And they were basically workhouses, and they were forced to do laundry and menial work. There was really no education going on. And so my girls, it was called the Good Shepherd. It was run by the Sisters of Charity nuns. And my girls in my book put together a scheme to escape and carry on with their lives. And there's much, much drama. But yeah, I was really pleased that my publisher, my editor, embraced the idea. I was afraid she would push back and say, well, that doesn't sound like a Susan Wiggs book, but
Yeah.
she let me forge ahead with it and really supported me. And I love how the book turned out. I can't wait to see what you
And
think.
and it comes out on July 15th,
It
right?
does. Yes.
but we can pre-order now. So,
Please do. I like
yeah.
there's a special place in heaven for readers who pre-order books because that tells the publisher that there's anticipation because they've got to
Yeah,
plan their print run orders. And the more information they have about who's might be interested in this book, the more accurate they can be.
yeah. So, was that hard? I mean, this is a hard story to tell.
Oh God.
So, how hard was that for you as a
It
writer?
it was really emotional, and one of the pieces of my research that I did was I found a Facebook group of survivors of this particular one,
Oh,
and
wow.
reading their story, and a few of them are now in a lawsuit because New York State has one of those look back laws where they remove the statute of limitations. If you were abused or harmed, no matter how long ago it was,
Yeah.
you can still find justice because
Mm,
this, I guess it's called the look back law. That's the one that was accessed by E. Jean Carroll to ultimately, take action against Trump for what he did to her. And a lot of the ones, I don't know, probably people are familiar with that film Spotlight about the
mm,
Boston, I think the Boston Globe reporters who pursued the clergy abuse. So a lot of
mm,
people
mhm,
involved in clergy abuse, which is what this was, were able to find justice because of these laws that removed the restrictions on when you can take action.
mhm.
Because, as you know, trauma freezes people from taking any kind of action at all.
Oh,
And
sure.
yeah, they make
Yeah.
a wake up call 50 years later and, they still deserve justice. And so, anyway, and I have to admit that some of the things that I learned that happened in this institution, I couldn't use in the book because they were too awful. It's not a soft book, and I didn't soft pedal anything, but there were a couple of things that, I didn't want them in my head, and I didn't wanna put them in anybody else's head, but
Yeah.
the ones that I felt like people could relate to and that would evoke the emotions and the drama of the moment, they're
Yeah.
definitely there. And then the other thing that I love about reading nonfiction and doing the research for my books is you get these little nuggets. And a librarian in Buffalo, a history librarian, told me that, or sent me an article that showed that the library bookmobile used to go to this institution every month, the Good Shepherd. And I didn't get a lot of information about that, but it was really cool that I found out about the bookmobile because it got to have a role in my story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And as I think about some of the themes of your books that I have read, it seems like there's always a sense of either belonging or resilience or even sometimes healing that comes through in the story. So I guess the first question is, do you agree with that kind of takeaway? And second of all, do you see that showing up in Wayward Girls?
I do, and I'm glad that you noticed that, and it's something that I think it's an element in my book or in any book that I would enjoy reading because, as we know, a character's journey is the narrative thread of the book, and so you want her to end up in a different place in the end versus where she was in the beginning. And since my books are commercial, and I like to think that they're aspirational and uplifting and things like that, I would hope that she would gain wisdom and insight and end up in a different, better place. And what was fun about writing Wayward Girls is that I got kind of a cast of characters, not just one, there's one main character, but all of the girls, we get glimpses of their journey along the way over their whole adult lives. And it was really cool to kind of imagine and predict where they would end up. Where am I going to be
Yeah.
in 20 years and 40 years, whatever. And so I liked showing that. And obviously, it was not all a bed of roses for all of them, but
Yeah.
it seemed like always they ended up in an appropriate place.
Nice. So you said you don't always well, the question's about to be, do you know what's next? Because you said you don't always know where your stories come from,
Right.
but do you always kind of have something brewing that's next?
Yeah, I do. And I'm at a crossroads right now because I've finished Wayward Girls and now I have a blank page in front of me. And that's one of my favorite places to be as a writer. Kind of a scary place because I feel like the stakes are high. I don't want to make a misstep here and go down the wrong road and end up spending months and months on something that's not going to be
Yeah.
rewarding to me or my career or my readers. And so one of the great pleasures of my life, and I think you must know this, is my relationship with my sister. Sounds like you've got two sisters. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I am a sucker for a really good sister story. I haven't written one in a while. I think my favorite sister story took place in Texas, in the Texas Hill Country. It was called Home Before Dark, and that was about two sisters. And so, but that was many years ago that I published that book. And so I don't know, for some reason, I've been thinking about my sister a lot. She lives very far away. She lives in Australia, and I live
Oh, my.
in Cambridge Island, Washington. So
Yeah.
we do a lot of this. We do a lot of FaceTime, and, visit when we can, at least once a year. But I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna maybe hang my story on some sisters. So we'll see where that goes.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I recently dug into some of my past published articles because I used to do a ton of freelance writing and articles for magazines, including Texas Parks and Wildlife. And so I did an article that we called Four-Wheel Drive Sisters. And we had taken my middle sister's four-wheel drive
Mhm,
and so we're wide in ages. So there's 17 years total between me and my oldest sister.
mhm.
And we did this whole Big Bend trip, and it's still one of my favorite
What you
articles
Big Ben?
because
Oh
there's
man, I had a chance to go to Big Ben.
have you not been?
We drove to Austin, well, to Dripping Springs to see the eclipse last April
Oh,
2020.
yeah.
We drove there from Washington because we had a camper, and we had a chance. We had to decide, oh, do I go to Big Bend or do I go to Marfa? We were on a tight schedule because the
Yeah.
was a very specific, 10-minute
Uh,
event. So we had to make a hard choice. So I that's one of my regrets. I think we probably should have done Big Bend, but probably we're going to do it in the future because I'm very drawn to that area. But
I told you I'd only published one novel, and it was set in Big
oh,
Bend.
was it really?
Big Bend is just an extraordinary place, and it
Well,
will always have a
doing it.
special
Okay.
space in my heart.
It's on my list then.
Yes, you will love it.
Okay, good.
Okay, next question. I'm not sure you're allowed to have a favorite, but what's your favorite bookstore?
My favorite bookstore? Probably Liberty Bay Books in Paulsbo, Washington, because it belongs to my best friend. So, yeah, she's a very, very well-published and decorated children's book author, Suzanne Selfers, and we met when she was just getting started and became writer friends first and then later became best friends. A few years back, oh god, it was right before COVID. She bought this little indie bookstore from the person who was retiring from it, and I think it was in February 2020. And so suddenly she's got this bookstore in this very cute little small town. It's like a Norwegian town in Washington near my home. And she managed to sustain and launch this bookstore. And it's very vibrant now. And I just love it because it's one of those bookstores that feels like home when you walk through the door. It's very
Yeah,
welcoming. It's really well organized. It's small enough that you don't get overwhelmed. I do love a big grand bookstore that feels like a cathedral, but the ones where I spend the most time are of more manageable size, I would say. But
yeah, I love it.
I've been lucky to be to bookstores like all over the world, but that one's just near and dear to my heart.
Yeah. Mm. So when you're not writing and you're traveling, what is feeding your creativity?
Probably Probably friends and family more than anything. I
Mm,
love spending time with friends and family. Jerry and I are lucky that we live on the beach on an island, and so we get to have a lot of adventures. We have a boat, and we can explore Puget Sound in our boat. We have two cute little dogs, and so there's a daily hike. We went on a road trip. We bought a camper that's not giant, but it's got everything we need in it so we can bring the dog.
yeah,
So we've been seeing the country. And of course, we love foreign travel. So I think just staying open to anything and everything, somebody that you meet. I was caregiving for both of my parents. They passed away now, but my mom's helpers that, came to the house to help me. You bond with people that
Yeah.
are, a part of your journey. And I feel like the stories just come out if you stay open to them. And so I don't ever like go looking for something, but I wait for like the moment that I described with my brother, looking at our childhood church. Um,
Mhm.
and suddenly I think you learn to pay attention to the signs. You feel like a little gut punch and you think, well, I need to look into that. It's a
Yeah.
mysterious process, but I think it hits us all. And if you're a writer, you know what to do with that. So we're
Yeah.
lucky in that. Some people are a little confused by that. What? Write it down? No, thank you. But for us, it kind of comes naturally.
What kind of dogs do you have?
I have 2 rescues. One of them is from Texas, Doug
Oh,
Peterson. Yep, I met him on a Zoom call like this. He was from a puppy mill. I don't
aw.
know, unfortunately, I think in Texas, there are still pet shops or something. They're illegal here in Washington because it
I don't think we have pet shops, but we definitely have
yeah,
the mills.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So he's a Chiweenie. And, like a wiener dog chihuahua, and then our other one is a Chiweenie with Daisy Bellamy. She's a Chiweenie with Pomeranian, so we've got a long
Oh, my.
short hair, and they're very cute. They're so cute. And in fact, they both Doug's inspired a whole book because I was, in between books, and my publisher came to me and they said, "We want you to write a Christmas book." And I was like, "Nah, I've done it. I've written Christmas books. I need to have a really good story to hang it on." And I remember we had just got Doug, and the way that you get a dog who's from away from out of state is they got to transport the dog to you. And sure enough, the shelter had a pet transport. It was like a tall Ford Transit van, and it was filled with dogs. And they took like 2 or 3 days to drive up here with the dogs. And we all had to meet them in a parking lot in Olympia, Washington to get our dogs. And it was the cutest thing. And I kind of went down that rabbit hole. Oh, pet transport is kind of a thing. And so I wrote The 12 Dogs of Christmas, and it was kind of inspired by that. So yeah, that came out in paperback last Christmas. And then the Christmas before it came out in hardback, The 12 Dogs of Christmas. And I always wanted that to be my Hallmark movie. And the Hallmark movie people said, 12 dogs, no, thank you. And they didn't want to have to juggle all that,
They know what they're talking about
they do.
when it comes
They
to
do.
dogs.
But yeah, that was like a really kind of warm-hearted romantic comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, if you think back to that creative storytelling little girl in Buffalo,
Mhm.
if you were kind of looking back and offering advice to her now, what would you tell her?
I think I probably would tell her, don't listen to the critics. Listen to your inner critic because she's you. But don't listen to
Yeah.
the critics who say, that's not good enough, that's not going to work. And I do think that maybe I didn't trust myself enough.
Mm.
And that's so common with writers. We question ourselves. A writer is such a divergent thinker because we think the story could go this way, the story could go that way. And so I think I kind of slowed myself down by questioning myself and doing too much listening to critics. And the other thing is, listen to your heart when life is pulling you, in one direction. Don't cling to the past and insist that it's got to be some way. So I would probably tell her that on whatever level she could understand it.
Yeah, and those are so good, and so it makes me think one more thing. So what did it feel like when you finally held your first book in your hand?
It was kind of surreal. I think most writers will tell you that it's like and you also feel kind of distant from it because these are the words that you wrote probably the year before or, some months before. And so it's a little bit surreal, but you flip through it and you think, wow, where did all these words come from? And I love it. And I have to say, I'm not one to read my books once they're published. I mean, I'll read
Yeah.
bits of them, but number one, I'm so sick of the story. I've spent so much time
Yeah.
going over and over and over it. And so, I've been there, done that. But I do love to read my books in audio format because audiobooks are there's such a good format because it feels like a fresh take on something that I've done. So I always listen to my audiobook. And so that's my go-to. And it always sounds better that I'm a better writer than I am when a really good voice talent reads it.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for being with me today and reminiscing a little. And, I love hearing your heart for storytelling. And we will absolutely be looking for Wayward Girls this summer. And I'll make sure everybody knows how to find you.
Well, thank you for finding me. One of the nice things about the internet, we have lots of complaints about it, but the way to connect people after many, many years can be really magical. So thank you, Elaine. It's been a pleasure.